The Gilded Halluciant year was 1883, and New York City glowed brighter than ever before. Electric lights flickered across Broadway, dazzling visitors who had never seen night transformed into day. Newspaper writers called it the Age of Progress, and magazine illustrations showed elegant men in top hats and women in silken gowns, stepping out of horse-drawn carriages. To the outsider, America seemed unstoppable, a land where fortunes could be made overnight and where everyone had a chance to climb into greatness. But behind the glittering windows of Fifth Avenue mansions, another America waited in the shadows. The streets just a few blocks away smelled of coal smoke, rotten cabbage, and sweat. Here stood the tenements' brick towers hastily thrown together to hold wave after wave of immigrants who poured into the country every month. Inside, whole families squeezed into a single room no larger than a horse stall, walls dripped with dampness, and rats skittered along floorboards. Babies slept in dresser drawers because there were no beds, and mothers rocked them to sleep while coughing from the thick, choking dust of nearby factories. The newspapers did not write about the endless nights when working men returned home, with soot-blackened faces, shoulders hunched, and hands so callous that they no longer felt pain. They did not write about children with hollow eyes, rising at dawn to run errands for pennies or to crawl under heavy machines in textile mills. The 1880s were the era of the Gilded Age, as Mark Twain had called it, a thin sheet of gold, covering a body of iron and rust. On the surface, America had riches beyond measure. Railroads cut across plains and mountains, their engines screaming like steel beasts, oil barons. Steel kings and railroad magnates rose to power, their names etched into history: Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt. These men lived in palaces that rivaled European royalty, throwing parties where champagne fountains sparkled and orchestras played until dawn. Guests wore diamonds the size of walnuts, while servants in white gloves carried silver trays of delicacies. Yet, while the wealthy few danced in chandeliers' glow, the masses trudged in darkness. For every mile of railroad track laid, countless workers risked their lives in dynamite blasts and landslides, often earning less than $1 a day. Chinese immigrants, who had built much of the western railroads, were spat upon and excluded. By law, Irish workers dug foundations for skyscrapers, but were told they were unfit to live in certain neighborhoods. Free black families, just decades out of slavery, faced Jim Crow laws in the South and hostile discrimination in the North. Factories, hummed with the promise of progress, but devoured the weak with relentless hunger. Cotton mills in the South pulled at poor children who should have been in school. They tied threads, swept dust, and carried bobbins for 12 hours straight, their lungs filled with fiber, and many would never live past 30. In the coal mines of Pennsylvania, men descended each morning into tunnels where light never reached, emerging at night with skin stained black. Explosions, cave-ins, and poisonous gases claimed thousands of lives. But the newspapers buried the reports under stories of dazzling inventions and millionaires' grand weddings. Life for women in this era was no gentler. The magazines that celebrated the ideal American home never spoke of the wives who bent their backs in kitchens without rest, cooking meals over with stoves while tending to endless children. They never spoke of immigrant mothers in tenements who took in laundry for wealthier families, their fingers cracked and raw from scrubbing. Even in rural areas, farm wives worked from before dawn until after dark, milking cows, planting crops, chopping wood, yet were never recognized as farmers. They were helpmeets, expected to endure in silence. But perhaps the harshest illusion was the promise held out to immigrants. Letters written home to Europe described America as a land where anyone could succeed, where the streets were paved with opportunity. When families sold everything to buy passage across the Atlantic, they arrived at Ellis Island with dreams glowing in their eyes. Instead, they were greeted by suspicion, exploitation, and poverty. Employers paid them less than native-born workers. Landlords crammed them into slums, and signs appeared in shop windows that read, "No Irish need apply." Many found themselves locked into cycles of debt they could never escape, and yet despite the hunger, the cold, the insults, and the weight of endless labor, people survived. They sang songs in their native tongues on crowded stoops. They held church gatherings where the sound of hymns rose above the noise of the streets. Children played stickball in alleyways, their laughter echoing against brick walls. Amid the harsh reality, there was resilience, a quiet determination that tomorrow might be better. Even if today was cruel, the America of the 1880s was not the dream that the world imagined. It was a land of contradictions, brilliance and darkness, progress and pain, wealth and crushing poverty. It was the gilded illusion shining bright on the surface, but underneath, millions endured struggles that would never make it into the history books. And yet, their endurance, their grit, and their sacrifice built the foundation upon which the nation would continue to rise. The silent struggles of women in the grand halls of the Gilded Age. Women in silk gowns twirled under glittering chandeliers. The magazines of the time painted them as symbols of refinement, graceful wives, loyal mothers, delicate ornaments to powerful men. Yet this was only the story told by those in wealth and privilege. For the majority of women in 1880s America, life was nothing like the pages of Harper's Weekly. Behind the lace curtains and beyond the polished parlors, women carried burdens that the world chose not to see dot in the countryside. Farm wives rose before dawn, their bodies aching from yesterday's labor. By the time the roosters crowed, they had already lit the stove, drawn water from the well, and started baking bread for families who depended on them. After breakfast, they milked cows, churned butter, tended chickens, and walked through fields to help with planting or harvest. They were not considered farmers by law or society. The title belonged to their husbands. Their work, though vital, was invisible, dismissed as women's duty. When winter storms froze the earth and supplies ran short, it was often the wives who stretched meals, sewed patched clothing, and comforted children through hunger diet in the cities. Women faced another kind of hardship. Factories opened their doors to female workers, but at a cruel cost. For 12 to 14 hours a day, women sat in stifling rooms sewing shirtwaists, stitching shoes, or assembling cigars. They earned less than half a man's wage for the same task, not because they worked less, but because society deemed them worth less. Foremen barked orders and threatened dismissal if they spoke of forming unions. The air in the sweatshops was thick with smoke, dust, and the heavy scent of damp cloth. By nightfall, many staggered home with swollen feet and aching backs only to face more chores waiting in their boarding houses or cramped tenement rooms. Immigrant women carried an even heavier burden. Fresh off the boats from Ireland, Germany, or Italy, many found work as domestic servants in wealthy households. They scrubbed floors until their knees cracked, polished silver that would never belong to them, and endured insults hurled by mistresses who saw them as little more than tools. Some lived in service and slept in attics or cellars, always on call, with no privacy and no family of their own nearby. For many, dignity was a luxury they could not afford. Yet even within these walls of servitude, women found strength in whispers shared in kitchens, in moments of laughter stolen during laundry work, in friendships that bound them together. Respectable society declared that a woman's place was in the home, but even there, her sacrifices were often thankless. In working-class neighborhoods, wives not only tended children, but also took in laundry, sewing, or piecework just to keep food on the table. They boiled shirts in heavy iron pots, stitched coats by lamplight, and carried baskets of clothes across muddy streets, their hands cracked from soap and their eyes strained from long nights of sewing. Yet when bills came due, their labor was rarely enough. Still, it kept families afloat, while husbands' wages disappeared into taverns or were swallowed by rent. Collectors' even education, which should have been a doorway to freedom, often shut its doors to women, while boys studied Latin and science. Many girls were taught only the basics of reading, writing, and sewing skills meant to prepare them for domestic life, not independence. A handful of women, however, dared to push beyond these boundaries. Teachers, writers, and reformers emerged, demanding that women be treated as equals. They gathered in parlors and church basements, organizing lectures and petitions. The suffragists of the 1880s were mocked by newspapers as unfeminine and unnatural, but they planted seeds of change that would not be silenced. One of the cruelties of the time was how society spoke of women's fragility while exploiting their endurance. Doctors claimed that too much education would damage a woman's delicate mind, and preachers warned that ambition would destroy her moral purity. Yet it was women who endured childbirth without medical aid, who buried children lost to fever, who kept families alive when wages failed. Their fragility was a myth, their resilience was real. And yet, amid hardship, women created spaces of hope. Sewing circles became not just places to mend clothes, but to share stories and advice. Churches became sanctuaries where hymns lifted weary hearts. Mothers told their daughters bedtime stories that carried traces of old homelands, preserving traditions against the erasure of poverty. Even in the narrowest confines, women found ways to nurture life, love, and resistance. By the late 1880s, voices for change grew louder. The sight of women marching for suffrage shocked onlookers, who believed women should remain silent. They held banners in the wind, their skirts dragging through the mud, their eyes fierce with determination. They were laughed at, jeered at, even attacked, but they did not stop. Behind them stood countless unnamed women toiling in kitchens, fields, and factories, each one part of the quiet force that kept America running. The newspapers of the Gilded Age celebrated industrialists, railroads, and inventions. But the true backbone of the nation was formed in silence. It was formed by women bending over washtubs, carrying water buckets, sewing by candlelight, rocking sick children to sleep while their own bodies ached. They were not written about, but they lived stories of endurance every day. The silent struggles of women in the 1880s were not tales of weakness, but of unyielding spirit. They were hidden battles fought in kitchens and factories, on farms and at boarding houses. Though society dismissed them, though history often forgot them, their strength built the foundation upon which future generations of women would rise. The frontier's harsh truth frontier of the 1880s has been romanticized in countless tales: cowboys riding into sunsets, brave settlers carving new lives out of untouched wilderness, and endless opportunities waiting in the wide-open West. To many dreamers, the frontier was a blank canvas where destiny could be written. But those who actually made the journey westward found not a land of easy riches, but a harsh and unforgiving reality that tested the very limits of human endurance. Families packed wagons with pots, quilts, and whatever belongings they could carry, leaving behind the crowded cities of the East in search of freedom and land. They were lured by the promises of the Homestead Act, 160 acres of free land, to anyone willing to build a home and cultivate it. Posters painted images of fertile fields and thriving farms, as if paradise lay just beyond the horizon. But when settlers reached the Great Plains, they discovered that dreams alone could not grow crops. The land was often dry, windswept, and stubborn. Summers baked the soil until it cracked like pottery, while winters unleashed blizzards so fierce that snow buried houses and cattle froze in their tracks. Water was scarce, and wells often failed. A farmer might toil for months, only to watch locust swarms descend and devour an entire year's harvest in a single afternoon. Some families starved, others gave up and returned east, and many who stayed buried children who did not survive the endless struggle against nature. The myth of the cowboy was another illusion of the frontier. Dime novels sold in eastern cities painted cowboys as glamorous heroes, gunslingers with silver spurs and fearless hearts. In truth, the cowboy's life was grueling and poorly paid. They worked from dawn until long after sunset, driving cattle across vast distances, sleeping under the open sky, and enduring dust storms that blinded their eyes and cracked their lips. Their hands blistered from reins and ropes, and their pay barely covered the cost of food and boots. Far from the myth of freedom, many cowboys were trapped in cycles of poverty, tied to ranches that exploited their labor. For women, the frontier was even harsher. A homestead wife lived in isolation, often miles from her nearest neighbor. Her home might be a sod hut walls made of grass and dirt, crawling with insects, the roof leaking whenever it rained. She cooked over open fires, washed clothes in rivers, and delivered her own children without the help of doctors. Loneliness gnawed at her as much as hunger did. Letters from family back east could take months to arrive, and many frontier women wept silently at night, yearning for voices they might never hear again. Yet these same women showed astonishing resilience, turning barren huts into homes, teaching their children to read by lamplight, and stitching quilts that warmed families through bitter winters. But the harshest truth of the frontier was the cost paid by Native American tribes. While settlers dreamed of free land, the reality was that this land was already inhabited, rich with history, culture, and sacred traditions. The U.S. government pushed tribes onto reservations through broken treaties and relentless military campaigns. The 1880s witnessed the final chapters of Native resistance, battles like Wounded Knee, where blood stained the plains and entire communities were devastated. Native children were forced into boarding schools, where their language and traditions were stripped away, their hair cut short, their names replaced. For them, the frontier was not a place of hope, but of loss, forced silence, and survival against erasure. Railroads, hailed as the symbol of progress, also brought destruction. Steel tracks cut across hunting grounds, scattering buffalo herds that had sustained Native people for centuries. With the herds gone, hunger spread, and dependence on government rations deepened. Meanwhile, railroad companies grew rich, selling land grants to settlers and controlling towns that sprouted along the tracks. For every town that flourished, another withered into a ghost town when mines ran dry or railroads changed course. Dreams were fragile on the frontier, shattered as quickly as they were built. Yet, amid the struggle, the frontier also bred a kind of resilience unmatched elsewhere. Neighbors learned to rely on one another, even when miles apart. Barn raisings became acts of collective survival, entire communities gathering to help one family build shelter before winter set in. Travelers stranded by storms were taken in by strangers who offered bread and fire, even when they had little themselves. In hardship, bonds were forged that carried people through the cruelest seasons. The frontier of the 1880s was not the romantic stage of dime novels, nor the glittering opportunity promised by land agents. It was a crucible of suffering and endurance. Those who survived became harder, tougher, and fiercely protective of what little they carved from the land. And though many failed farms lost, families broken, lives cut short, the stories of their struggle became part of America's backbone, shaping the myth of resilience that endures even today. The West was never free, never easy, and never gentle. It was a land that demanded everything: blood, sweat, and tears, and in return offered only the hope that tomorrow might be kinder than today. The forgotten faces of the city be the 1880s. America's great cities were rising fast, their skylines pierced with the steel frames of new skyscrapers, their streets alive with trolley cars and the hum of factories. To the world, cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia were symbols of progress, proof that the nation was marching boldly into the future. But beneath the towers of wealth and invention lived another America, one that history often forgets, the city of the poor, the immigrant, the outcast, and the weary dot at Ellis Island. Ships arrived daily, carrying exhausted families from Ireland, Italy, Germany, and Eastern Europe. They stepped onto the docks clutching bundles of clothing and faded letters, their eyes bright with hope. The dream was simple: freedom, work, and a chance for their children to have a better life. Yet the moment they left the harbor, many found themselves thrust into neighborhoods where alleys stank of sewage. Tenement buildings leaned as if ready to collapse, and the cries of hungry children echoed through narrow hallways. Tenement life was a trap. A single building might hold hundreds of people, each family squeezed into one dark room. Windows were few, ventilation non-existent, and the air thick with smoke from coal stoves. Diseases spread like fire: tuberculosis, cholera, and diphtheria claimed thousands of lives each year, especially children whose small bodies could not endure. The newspapers described these neighborhoods as breeding grounds of vice. Yet little was done to ease the suffering. Reformers who entered the slums wrote of babies sleeping on bare floors, mothers nursing infants while sewing shirts by candlelight, and men collapsing from exhaustion after 16-hour shifts. Factories demanded endless labor, and the workers had no choice but to obey. In textile mills, young girls stood on aching feet all day, their small hands darting among dangerous machines. One wrong move, and fingers were lost forever. In steel mills, the roar of furnaces was so loud that men shouted to be heard, their faces blistered from the heat. Coal dust filled miners' lungs until breathing itself became a struggle. Yet, for all this, wages were barely enough to keep food on the table. Immigrant men often took second jobs hauling carts, shoveling snow, or sweeping streets, while women washed clothes for the wealthy or mended garments for pennies. Prejudice sharpened the struggle. Signs outside factories warned, "No Irish need apply." Italians were mocked as criminals, Jews accused of greed, Chinese laborers beaten and banned by law. For black families migrating north from the south, the promise of freedom was met with bitter discrimination in housing and jobs. In crowded boarding houses, strangers of different nations lived side by side, forced together by poverty, but divided by language and mistrust. And still, each group clung to its own traditions, prayers whispered in foreign tongues, songs sung in the evenings that reminded them of home, festivals held in back alleys where laughter tried to chase away despair. Children of the slums bore the harshest weight. Instead of school, many were sent into the streets to shine shoes, sell newspapers, or pick coal from railroad tracks. They wore rags that barely held together, their bare feet numb in winter snow. Some became newsboys, shouting headlines at passers-by for a penny, their voices hoarse and their stomachs empty. Others scavenged through trash for scraps of food, A lucky few attended settlement houses run by reformers who taught reading and offered warm soup. But for most, survival was the only education. And yet, within this misery, resilience burned. Tenement families built communities in the face of hardship. Women shared bread and stories across doorways, watching one another's children when work called. Men gathered in saloons not only to drink but to speak of unions, strikes, and the dream of fair wages. Churches rang with hymns in many languages, their pews filled with workers who found comfort in faith. Out of the slums rose leaders who began to speak for the voiceless, organizers, preachers, writers determined to challenge the indifference of the powerful. The 1880s also brought the first sparks of labor revolt. Strikes erupted in railroads, factories, and mines, led by men and women tired of working like beasts for crumbs. The Haymarket Affair of 1886 in Chicago left the nation divided, some calling workers anarchists, others calling them heroes. For the poor, it was a symbol that their voices mattered, even if the cost was blood on the cobblestones. Meanwhile, the wealthy paraded along streets only blocks away, blind to the suffering beneath them. They attended operas, drove carriages through Central Park, and hosted glittering parties where champagne flowed like rivers. But if they looked out the window at night, they might have seen the glow of a single candle in a tenement window, burning beside a mother sewing to feed her children. That small flame, though fragile, spoke more of courage than all the chandeliers of the Gilded Age. The forgotten faces of the city did not make it into the headlines of progress. They were not the ones celebrated in gilded halls or etched into marble, but their sweat powered the factories, their backs built the railroads, their hands stitched the clothes, and their dreams, though battered, kept the nation alive. The city of the 1880s was not just a place of towering ambition and dazzling wealth. It was also a labyrinth of shadows where families fought each day against hunger, disease, and despair. It was a place where children grew up to fast, where mothers carried burdens too heavy, and where men bent under labor that broke their bodies. Yet in their endurance, there was something unbreakable and unspoken resilience that whispered, "We will not be erased." The chains of prejudice of the 1880s were hailed as the age of progress. Yet for millions, progress was a locked door. Behind its polished brass handle stood opportunity, but the key was withheld from anyone deemed the wrong color, race, or origin. Beneath the glitter of the Gilded Age ran a darker current, prejudice born of fear and power, which bound entire communities in invisible chains. For Black Americans, life after the Civil War had promised freedom, but the reality of the 1880s was bitter. The Reconstruction era had ended, and with its collapse came the rise of Jim Crow laws across the South. Courtrooms upheld segregation, declaring it natural that white and black lives remain apart. Separate schools, separate train cars, separate water fountains, and too often separate cemeteries. The promise of equality was replaced with poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation that kept black men from voting. Freedom meant little when lynching became the tool of terror, and mobs could strip away life in an instant without consequence. In the North, things were little kinder. Though slavery was gone, discrimination wore new clothes. Employers refused to hire black men for skilled trades, relegating them to the most backbreaking labor. Black women were largely confined to work as domestic servants, cleaning homes, and raising children that were not their own. In neighborhoods, prejudice hung heavy. Landlords charged higher rents for smaller rooms. Schools remained underfunded, and opportunity remained a whispered promise never fulfilled. And yet out of these conditions grew remarkable resilience. Churches became havens of hope. Gospel choirs filled the air with strength, and communities clung together like families. Out of hardship rose leaders, preachers, and thinkers who reminded their people that dignity could not be legislated away. But Black Americans were not alone in this struggle. Across the West, Chinese immigrants faced hostility so fierce it was enshrined in law. They had been brought in by railroads and mines, their labor praised as essential when it was cheap. But once the tracks were laid and prosperity grew, resentment followed. Yellow peril, newspapers screamed, fanning fear of foreign workers who stole jobs. Violence erupted, whole Chinatowns were burned, families driven out with torches and fists. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, the first major U.S. law to ban immigration by race. It declared Chinese people unworthy of citizenship, unwelcome as neighbors, and unwanted as Americans. For those already here, life meant living in enclaves, their culture mocked, their children bullied, their future bound in narrow alleys. Irish immigrants, too, felt the sting of hatred. They were called drunkards, criminals, and pests. No Irish need apply signs barred them from offices and shops. They were forced into the hardest jobs, digging canals, laying track, policing streets, while being caricatured in cartoons as apes unfit for civilization. Italians faced similar scorn, accused of carrying disease, blamed for crime, and treated as perpetual outsiders. Jewish immigrants arriving from Eastern Europe found prejudice waiting for them. As well, landlords refused them, universities capped their enrollment, and whispers of anti-Semitism spread through clubs and newspapers. Native Americans bore perhaps the harshest blow of all. By the 1880s, most had been forced onto reservations, their land seized, their buffalo herds annihilated. Boarding schools took their children, stripping them of language, hair, names, and faith. Teachers beat them for speaking their mother tongues, preaching instead that civilization meant forgetting who they were. For tribes who had walked those lands for centuries, the 1880s brought not only poverty, but an erasure of identity itself. Women of color carried double burdens. A black woman working as a maid in the South endured both the sting of racism and the silencing of sexism. Native women on reservations became seamstresses for government rations, stripped of traditional roles that once gave them power. Immigrant mothers in tenements endured insults while washing clothes or selling vegetables on street corners. Their strength was unrecorded in history books. Yet without them, families would have crumbled. Still, in the midst of hatred, voices of defiance rose. Black educators like Booker T. Washington founded schools to teach dignity and skill. Chinese communities built temples and businesses, refusing to vanish despite exclusion. Irish workers joined unions, their songs of resistance echoing in saloons. Jewish immigrants carved spaces for worship and learning, keeping their faith alive. In the face of prejudice, Native elders whispered stories to children by firelight, ensuring that even if schools silenced their tongues, their heritage would not die. The chains of prejudice in the 1880s were not made of iron, but of laws, insults, stereotypes, and violence. They wrapped around every opportunity, pulling it just out of reach for those who dreamed of equality. Yet chains, no matter how heavy, cannot crush the spirit entirely. In quiet defiance, in whispered prayers, in the simple act of enduring another day, the oppressed carried within them seeds of a future that prejudice could not wholly destroy. History often remembers the 1880s as a gilded age of wealth, railroads, and invention. But beneath the surface, millions lived behind barriers they had not built. Their stories are not tales of weakness, but of resilience, of surviving in a world that refused to see them, of holding on to hope when society tried to snuff it out. Theirs is the story of strength in chains, courage in silence, and dignity in the face of scorn. The spirit that endured the 1880s were a time of contradictions, and age wrapped in gold on the outside, but forged in hardship beneath. Factories roared, cities rose, and fortunes were made, but for most Americans, life was not a dream, but a daily trial of survival. They faced hunger, prejudice, disease, and loss, and yet, even within this crucible of suffering, something remarkable endured, the spirit of resilience that no law, no chain, no storm, and no cruelty could extinguish. It lived first in the farmer on the Great Plains. He rose each morning to stare at fields cracked by drought or buried in snow, knowing his harvest might fail and his children might go hungry. Still, he hitched his plow and broke the stubborn earth, trusting that one day it would yield. Beside him stood his wife, her hands raw from work, her voice steady as she told her children bedtime stories that wrapped their fragile lives in hope. Though locusts devoured their crops and blizzards rattled their windows, their determination built towns, schools, and churches in places where once there had been only silence. It lived in the women of the cities, hunched over sewing machines or bent above washtubs, their shoulders aching, their eyes dim with exhaustion. They were told their labor was invisible, that their voices should remain silent. Yet they whispered encouragement to one another in boarding houses, formed sewing circles that became secret councils of strength, and walked side by side in early marches that planted the seeds of future rights. Their entrance carried families through winters. Their quiet rebellion carved a path for daughters yet unborn. It lived in the immigrants, stepping off ships with nothing but callous hands and borrowed dreams. They were mocked for their accents, scorned for their clothes, cheated by bosses and landlords. Yet in the alleys of New York and the mills of Chicago, they built new lives out of nothing. They formed communities where old songs met new soil, where tradition survived in the glow of candles lit in cramped rooms. Though America's welcome was cruel, they claimed a place in its story through sheer ignorance. Lived in Black Americans who faced laws designed to strip away their freedom, mobs that tried to crush their dignity, and courts that turned a blind eye to justice. And yet, they built schools, churches, and businesses in defiance of hatred. They raised children to believe in a future that seemed impossible. They sang spirituals that carried sorrow and strength together, music that could not be silenced by prejudice. Their resilience was not just survival, it was resistance. A quiet declaration that their humanity could not be denied. Lived in the native tribes, broken by war and stripped of land, yet still breathing life into traditions that others sought to erase. Around fire circles, elders whispered stories to children, reminding them of ancestors, rivers, and buffalo herds that once thundered across the plains. Though governments tried to sever their roots, their culture endured. Underground songs, sung in secret, dances performed in hidden gatherings, words kept alive in defiance of forced silence. They carried memory itself as a weapon against erasure. It lived in the workers who filled the factories, the railroads, and the mines. Men whose lungs blackened with coal dust, whose hands shook from exhaustion, whose backs bent under the weight of endless labor. They were treated as expendable, yet they learned the power of standing together. In strikes and protests, they lifted their voices not just for wages, but for dignity. The Haymarket martyrs, the union organizers, the nameless men and women who risked jobs and lives to demand fairness, all carried within them a stubborn belief that justice could be won. The spirit of the 1880s was not found in chandeliers, carriages, or mansions. It was found in the single candle burning in a tenement window while a mother sewed shirts to feed her children. It was found in the plow cutting frozen soil, in the hymn sung in a crowded church, in the laughter of children playing stickball in alleyways, their joy defying hunger. It was found in every whispered prayer, every act of kindness, every choice to endure another day when despair seemed easier. This was the true legacy of America in the 1880s. The railroads, factories, and fortunes may dominate the headlines, but it was the resilience of ordinary people that built the backbone of the nation. Their names may be forgotten, their faces absent from portraits, but their strength carved the path forward. They endured not because the world was kind, but because they refused to surrender. And in their ignorance lies the most powerful truth of all. Dreams are not built in comfort. They are born in hardship, tested in fire, and carried by those who dare to hope when hope seems foolish. The men and women of the 1880s, farmers, immigrants, workers, women, Black Americans, native tribes, each carried that hope like a fragile flame through storms of prejudice, poverty, and loss. And though the Gilded Age shone with false promises, their quiet resilience lit a truer, deeper light, one that has never gone out. The harsh reality of life in America's 1880s was not the dream the world imagined. It was harder, darker, and crueler, but it was also the proving ground of a spirit that endured, a spirit that, against all odds, whispered, "Tomorrow will come, and we will still be here."